So good to see you all here. I'm interested in that some of you are probably related to me. And we just don't know that yet, do we? You know, that's the trick. You know, we've all been around, and you know, I've left, let's see, started out in the early 50s, and so I have some historical knowledge in my lifetime, but you know, you go back a couple of generations and there are lots and lots of connections. So I'm really glad to know that, first of all, you guys are interested in history. You know, there's a commonality there. And some of you may be more into the genealogy side of things or the historic document side of things, but I'd like to kind of show you how I went about exploring my history. And I also wanted to say, there's probably other secrets I can share with you, because you don't want to agree to be my relative, right? Unless you think it's a good history. And you know, I have a very strong Harford County history, part of which was in 1966, I was the second best swine judge in the state of Maryland. I've rarely ever taught people that. So, you know, already I feel bonded with you guys. Yeah, I was in 4-H for many years, and livestock judging was one of the things I did. I also went to the 4-H camp up in northern part of the Rocks. And my father was head of the Sheep Breeders Association of Maryland, and also head of the Tree Growing Society. So there's a lot of different connections that might happen. So let me ask you, do any of you remember ever going to cut your own tree down in Joppa for the holidays? You might have been to Good Endeavor Farm, because we sold thousands of trees. And what was the other thing? Turkeys. We used to have thousands of turkeys. Anybody remember buying turkeys back in the 50s or 60s? No, nobody here was alive then. But so there are all these little things we've done in the past, and it's always fun to have somebody come up and say, I remember getting a tree at your place. So that's some of my connections here. Okay, so who am I? I'm an outdoors guy, right? I grew up on a farm, so I like being outdoors. And so when you study and go to college, you have to pick a major, and I ended up in geology, because every week we got to hike in the woods, which was great. And so, you know, I became an earth scientist and environmental scientist, and have spent a career in that arena. What's interesting is all that history of mine is with writing nonfiction, right? As a scientist, I'm a nonfiction writer. And so my first two books, there on the left and the bottom, were nonfiction pieces. And they were much easier for me to write than a fiction piece, because I knew a lot of that stuff. You know, I tested it out. And so when I sat down to write the Chesapeake Watershed, you know, I'd been working on the watershed for 50 years, and so, or 40 years by that point. So I could write those stories and make them engaging so people would care more about the Chesapeake. When I got to fiction, this third one over, one on the right bottom corner, is people told me I had to write for the kids. You know, my other books were probably more for people our age. So I wrote this teenage coming-of-age book, which was fascinating to me in trying to understand where they were today. And think about coming of age, that's always a challenging time. But today, it may be even a little bit more challenging. And so I think I wrote that to inspire them that no matter where they end up, they can make a difference in this country. And I think we all have that responsibility, in a sense, right, to help each other make a difference. And so that's my first fiction piece. And then this new piece came out of a couple of things. It was a desire we probably all have to tell our stories. I think 80% of Americans say they want to tell their stories. The question is, how do you do that? How do you do it so it inspires other people, first of all, to read, and second of all, to write their stories down? And so if nothing else, I hope my presentation today will stimulate each of you to think about, what is that box of knowledge that you know better than anybody else? You may not think it's significant to your neighbors, but let me tell you, it's fascinating as you start delving into what you've done, what your parents have done, what your great-grandparents have done. And the question is, how do you synthesize that in some way that inspires others to read it too. And that was a struggle I went through. So here I am out in the woods as usual. I even have let's see, that's not the right way. All right. A few literary references to books I've read in my life that have inspired me to be a better person, that inspired me to do something with my life. Certainly there's fictional ones. Anybody ever read Kenneth Roberts back in the 50s and 60s? Northwest Passage, Green Mountain Boys, Rabble in Arms. Those were fascinating to me as a kid. You know, because it was adventure. It was adventure outside of my domain. And a lot of that took place in the upper Northeast. But what was interesting is there were other fictional pieces that did continue to inspire me. Certainly, James Michener, wrote Chesapeake. How many of you read Chesapeake? A fair number of people. It may not be the greatest literature ever done, but it was really, a couple of scenes there still stick in my mind that I think about quite often from reading that book. And then John Barth. Anybody read John Barth? He was a Hopkins professor that won some major awards. But it really was the seamy side of our history. It was showing how bad we treated each other for many centuries. And some of that's true, and some of that gives you a sense of what reality might have been. In the nonfiction area, certainly Tom Horton and William Warner are great reads. William Warner did Beautiful Swimmers, gorgeous piece of work. And then I came across a book by Drew Lanham, who happened to be a boy that grew up on a farm, very similar to the way I grew up, except he was an African-American guy, that was able to own a farm at that time. He wrote about his life in the 50s and 60s. And so there were a lot of parallels that inspired me to keep reading. So let's see. So that's a few literary references to show some of my exposure, I guess. Okay, this guy's going to stay on top of me today. He's going to make sure everything I say is true, right? Or maybe not true. Maybe fiction. But pileated woodpecker, it's just a striking pose. So, why do we explore the past? Why do we care about the past? Well, I have a couple reasons why I care about the past today. The first of all is, there's not a month that goes by, maybe even a week that goes by, that I don't think I wish my father was still alive. We had a bond, and he inspired me in a lot of ways, but I would like his counsel on how to be a father, how to be a grandfather, and those sorts of things. And so I always often think about my ancestors and who were they? I knew my father pretty well, I think. I think I knew my grandparents somewhat, but once you get further back than that, we have very little knowledge of the personalities we're talking about. We have names and dates, but what were the personalities like? And did you inherit anything from them? Did they inspire you in some way? Do you have any physical traits that reflect them? And so that's kind of the game I wanted to play, is understanding these people. Not that it had to be exactly right, but if I could approach the topic in some way that would give us all a better feeling for how our ancestors acted under the situations they faced, I thought that might be helpful for the decisions I have to make today and my kids have to make tomorrow. So, why explore the past? What did I learn? And how to engage and inspire others? The big challenge. So the first thing I did, was to pull together information that would be helpful for me to assess this. I wanted to pull together as much of the factual information as well as the stories, which you don't know if fact or not. But they are a representation of the history based on the perspective of whoever wrote that. The second thing I explored the past for was, all of a sudden, I was the terminal generation. All of a sudden, the boxes of stuff that had been held in the attic and the back of the closet all came to me. How many of you had that experience? And how many of you did nothing about it at the time? So I wanted to take the time, and I was helped along by the pandemic, which gave me a lot of extra time, to open the boxes, look at the pictures, take notes from it, try to figure out what was in those boxes. And I think the third reason I like to study the past is I do think our roots are important. And I don't think I've done a great job communicating that knowledge to the younger generations. In fact, once your kids get to be about 3, they don't listen to you anymore. And then in their 20s, they just disappear. And then in the 30s and 40s, they start thinking, oh, these guys are getting old, we've got to take care of them. Doesn't mean they have to listen to us, So that's the big challenge, right? But I wanted to leave something that might be inspiring to them and help them deal with the decisions they had to make. Okay, so when you write a book, you got to pick a setting. Well, that was easy for me. I picked the farm that I grew up on. That's the place where I really grew into a human and understood the human-land conflict, basically. How we deal with the nexus between humans and the land and the resources and the water and the air, all those things. And so picking a setting, I picked it right about in there. And I'm going to talk about 2 different areas today a little bit. One is this area in Harford County and that area in Howard County, which are very close to each other, very similar in many ways. And they both helped me understand the bigger picture. So what do we got here? We got a topographic map. This is actually an image where they remove the vegetation. So this is like the landform map. And you can see some dramatic things here. Look how flat this area is. Just imagine, not all of your ancestors who have been here 300 years, but many have. We all have more recent ancestors than others. But just imagine sailing across from Europe or the Caribbean and coming up here after being in the rough waters of the Atlantic, probably being sick half the time, probably starving. And then some of us were certainly enslaved too, so we were in chains. And all of a sudden he got out of that stormy Atlantic, came up to Chesapeake, which is thousands of miles of shoreline, where lots of people can live and ship their stuff to a market. And so that's pretty much happened in the 1700s. So a lot of the early plantations and properties were in this flat-lying area called the coastal plain. Now, at some point, you can't sail any farther west. You come up against the Piedmont rocks, which are the granites like this building's built out of, and the black gabbros, all these different types of rocks, many of which had metallic material in it. We were just talking at lunch today about how asbestos was mined here, as well as all sorts of heavy metals of different types, coal, a whole variety of things were mined in this part of the country. But anyhow, so as you come in here, at some point you run up against these rocks, and that's called the fall line. Everything west of that is rocky, and the foothills to the west. And what's east of that is very flat-lying, sands, silts, and clays, all of which have value, but different values. So as we went west, we exploited that. What's interesting is most of the major cities on the East Coast are built along that fall line. I mean, I-95 follows that fall line, and the migrating birds follow that line, but also our civilization was based on city growth in New York, Newark, Wilmington, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, Richmond. They all fall in the fall line. Okay, so about 1700, we exploited most of this area, and we were moving west. Wealthier folks would buy big plots of land west of the fall line and start, again, the same process of denuding the country, right, and starting to plant various crops. Okay, so as you know, this coastal plain is sands and silts, and where do they come from? This was a major axis of the collision between Africa and North America. And so this area called the Piedmont in here was full of volcanoes at one point. It was a collision zone where things got pushed down and pushed up and melted and squeezed. And so much different geology than what's east of the fall line. But east of the fall line is a thickening wedge of sediments that's only a few feet thick along here. But as it goes east, it gets then 7,000 feet thick, and then 30,000 feet thick out by the continental shelf. And all that material came from the erosion of the mountain belt that lay here at one point. You know, these mountains of the Appalachians were 30, 40,000 feet thick at one point. All that eroded, dumped into the coastal plain. Okay, so there's a lot of different geologies here, ecologies here, watersheds that all influence the development of this area that we call the Central Piedmont of Maryland. Okay, what else are we going to show? Here we go. Okay, and aside from being a great place to settle into, this was a pretty dramatic area to live too, because there's a lot of trees, a lot of forests, lots of nuts, lots of things growing here. And the great temporal forests of one of the three major temporal forests of the planet, a great place for resource exploitation. So here's a huge sycamore tree. And so the eastern woodlands are a major asset. The Chesapeake Bay, which was probably the most prolific estuaries on the face of the earth, was right here to be exploited, and the Atlantic Flyway to bring all those geese and ducks down here in the wintertime when we needed something to eat. Okay, so sense of place when they landed? You know, it depends what landing you're talking about, because when we first landed, there were a lot of people here. We somehow left a lot of disease for them that we brought with us. So smallpox and other diseases wiped out as many as 90% of the Native Americans in that first century, pretty much before we came over to settle. So from 1500 up to 1600. There wasn't a lot of settlement, but from 1600 on, there was settlement, but many of the Native Americans had perished by then. But if you talk to the existing people who have descended from the Piscataway peoples, is what they call themselves, you can see that they were mainly a coastal plain group of tribe, and that they did out in this area, some of them out at Aberdeen Proving Ground, but a lot of it was areas where they came through shooting game, you know, places they went game hunting. And so this lower part is Piscataway, the upper part is mainly influenced by the Susquehannocks. Yeah, that's their outline. So we know they existed at that point, and they did a lot of husbandry in the sense of they shaped the way our woods are today. They burned and cut a lot of trees for shelter and for fuel and for shipping and for canoes. But they also had areas where they did not cut down the nut trees and the fruit trees. You know, they left them to regenerate because that's what they lived on. So that's starting to look at some of the images I used to help me understand what it might have looked at those times. Okay. I started reading a lot of stuff, a lot of books, a lot of articles, a lot of the things I collected. And it was really hard for me to get a good visualization of what it was like. You know, it's pretty simple to say somebody lived in a log cabin. But what does that really mean? Do you want to live in a log cabin where there's no water maybe that runs? You know, there's lots of things that happened in the last 100 years that make us, you know, not really appreciate the way things used to be. But certainly these flying ships, as the Native Americans called them evidently, were wondrous inventions, something much more significant than the type of ships the North Americans had. But you start looking at these closely, would you really want to cross the ocean in one of these ships? I mean, they probably leaked a little bit. I'm sure they smelled badly. You know, things were dripping. It was probably awful, even if you were a wealthy person. And certainly for the lower economically folks, it was a really tough transit. But look at this a second. Now here's a ship, a whole series of them. This was the lifeline our ancestors had to Europe. You see, if you grew something like tobacco, you had to sell it. And the ship didn't come in because there was a war going on. What do? There wasn't much interior traffic at that point. It's very much all based on sailing. Another thing I looked at in this painting, I think I would know how to do this, is to take a look not just at the ships, but the tidewater area here, It looks like it's low tide. And look how lovely this little stretch of path is in this town. So these buildings, then you have a lot of horses and oxen dropping the waste on the streets. You're walking through it, it's dripping off into the bay. So we have this challenge, and we have it today too, but the challenge then was, how do you increase your number of people living in an area without the need for some sort of laws and regulations and management of waste systems, and sources of infrastructure to bring food in and take or bring merchandise in. So it was a real interesting I'm sure there's many, many discussions that happened before we developed a rule of law that made any sense for us. So jumping ahead a little bit, again, I like to use artwork. I love to use paintings to understand an area. And then here's a photograph in the late 1800s showing a few trees in the Susquehanna River that were cut down throughout Pennsylvania and Maryland down to this point. And this is a mile-wide river choked with trees that we were sending to market. A lot of it went to rebuilding the British fleet. A lot of it was the houses, the bridges, the docks, the roads, the churches that we all went to at that point. It just gives you this guttural feeling what it was like and how this was good merchandising, right? This is taking a resource and exploiting it. But there was, we got out of balance a lot of times when we tried to do that. Okay, so now I've given you the big picture and the medium-sized picture. Let's go down to the place I focused in on. So here's Baltimore. I like to point out that on this side of Baltimore, you have the Patapsco River that kind of craters Baltimore in the south. And up here, we have the Gunpowder Rivers, pretty much cratering the city to the north. So kind of think of this ecosystem. And it's all part of the Piedmont. Here's the fall line, pretty much following Route 40, Route 1. This is the Piedmont area where you have these various metals and things copper and chromium and things like that you can exploit. And of course, a lot of this was exploited for tobacco too. If you look right here, we have a dot that says Joppatown and Kingsville, Edgewood, Bel Air, Harvard Grace, all places we talk about in my book. And what's interesting to me is this Joppatown is where Joppatown is today, is similar, in some parts, to where Joppatown was in 1695 at the start of the story. But it was kind of on the frontier at that point. And so you went any farther west at this scale, fewer and fewer people would be found. It was right on the border of the frontier. Here's Aberdeen Proving Ground. So let's go in a little bit closer on this. Okay, here's I-95, right through here. Anybody driving 95 today? Okay, good. When you drive an I-95, you go through an area right next to the Little Gunpowder Falls, which was a farm that I grew up on, called Good Endeavor. And you can see it's due north of Joppatown, old Joppatown in this area. So it's a step out to the frontier of cutting down trees and planting tobacco initially, and then grains. And here's Joppatown today. And it existed as a port for about 50 or 60 years. It was called the Queen of the Northern Chesapeake. All roads led to Joppa at one point. And then all our farming practices and cutting down all the trees resulted in, guess what? A lot of siltation into the bay. And so we lost a lot of our ability to use this as a port because much of this was silted in and the big ships, sailing ships, could not get in here. And so guess what? Overnight, it basically disappeared. They took down the stones and the boards, took them into Baltimore, and that became a major port, deeper water port. Okay, so that's kind of where we're going. I don't know if anybody drive on Route 7 today? Few people? Okay, so if you were coming up here on I-95 and cross the river, you would see, let's see, what would you see? 95 would talk to, you see this big bend, and they've been doing a lot of construction along here recently. We had 8 lanes. Why do we need 12 lanes? Because we all drive too much, right? So if you're coming from, say you come down 152 to Route 7, go west, you used to come in on Bulls Lane, but Bulls Lane is gone now. Well, it's not gone. It's not. Yeah, it's there, but it's dead-ended.
Same as when I was a child at Old Post Road. Still there, Bulls Lane.
Yeah.
Yep.
That ends at that new development
It does.
That's right.
when you cross the creek.
So now you have to go down to the development called Gunpowder, which has developed this area. Okay, so you can see it's off Route 7. We'll see more about that in a minute. There's Gunpowder. I look at this as a beautiful memorial to what was there before. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two places a little bit. One is Good Endeavor, which you've just seen where it is. The other is Mount Pleasant, which is a plat, same year plat, 1695. They both have plats. So that was a kind of a time reaching out into Piedmont that they were slicing and dicing. What's interesting, they're both Piedmont rivers. They have a lot of waterfalls in them. They have a lot of mills built on them. I think Little Gunpowder probably had, or the Gunpowder had 6 or 8 mills on it. And then the Patapsco River on the other side of in Howard County had like 38 mills on it. So that was big business at some point when that technology came along. And that was the start of the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century. Okay, both near the fall line, they both have the same age plats. They both are dependent on ports. So our port was Joppa, their port was Elkridge, another one that didn't last very long because of the same type of farming practices. They both were log cabins on a hill. I had thought, why didn't they put the log cabin down by the river? Lots of different reasons, I guess, but they both had enslaved and indentured labor. That labor helped a lot in the farming, dug wells, built additions and roads. You know, it was incorporated. That was a valuable economic asset in addition to human assets at that time. And here's a picture of the geology of the Joppatown area, where you have Joppatown sitting here initially. This is the black gabbro rock I talked about that had a lot of metals in it for iron ore and chrome. And then the brown is a series of cobbles. There's a first layer of stuff that came off of the Appalachian Mountains. And then the yellow is recent sediments. So you can look at this port that once was a major port for big ships, and they could no longer get in there because all this silt came in and filled it up because, again, of farming practices. Okay, so Joppa. Joppa Road it's kind of between Joppatown and Towson. There's pretty much a ridge there that Joppa Road follows. You can see here that it was a port from 1712 to 1768. And at this time, when it first started, 1635, a troop of rangers from the garrison, his job was to keep an eye on the Native Americans. Okay, here's Joppatown today. You can see how much of this is silted in. They still have to dredge it. Jerusalem Mill, we used to take grain there in the 50s and 60s. Great place to support today. It's a great living heritage sort of place. And you can see the waterfalls, which was so valuable for the manufacturing basis of this country. I don't know if you appreciate it, but iron ore was our second greatest export out of the Bay Area. A lot of iron ore. George Washington's father invested in a number of them up and down the Bay. And so that was part of the great manufacturing history of Baltimore, was all the local ores. And from the 1850s up to the 2070s, that was one of our major economic engines here. Okay, and the other thing I kept realizing is every time I drove through here, I never slowed down to read these signs. So I had to do that. In fact, now you can see them all online, so you don't have to drive. But a lot of history happened here. And that was the thing that attracted me. And I decided to take that history and take as much family information I had and just put them two together and make the history come alive in some way. So Harry Gilmore, I talk about him and his raid, local raid. Lafayette, Rochambeau, Captain John Smith. All these things tell you there's something behind the wood, behind the trees.
Signs are thanks to J. Alexis Shriver of Only Farm.
Well, great.
He was the one that got that started.
And that was back in when?
From
40s?
1920, 40,
Even-
somewhere
yeah,
in there before
yeah.
World War II. But
So
you can't get one anymore.
that was the horse farm, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I grew up right across the road from there.
You did? I
Yeah.
remember seeing you.
Oh, yeah. I spent my whole youth there.
We could ride our horses over to the farm. Mrs. Rogers gave us lessons.
Oh, yes.
She
Well,
was
you
a very
probably
soft-
saw me.
She was a soft, tender-hearted person, as I remember. Sit up straight!
Classic British riding instructor.
She was great. Okay, and so the industrial age came along, and we had fancier and bigger grist mills, and we started building the chromium, the copper, the iron, the steel, all sorts of stuff in the inner harbor eventually. You remember that. I remember that. Okay, I have a couple of pictures up here we can look at later, after I speak. So this one is pretty much Civil War time in the inner harbor of Baltimore. This is Pratt Street. These are horses pulling train cars through the downtown part because engines were not allowed to be in cities. So they had to unload all the train cars from President Street Station and take them over to Camden Street. And this is where the first bloodshed of the Civil War occurred because one of our local political savvy mobs called the Plug Uglies started throwing snowballs and stones and then finally shooting the people walking through town. Aside from the fact that they were probably more conservative than the Massachusetts people, which certainly. But anyhow, what I thought was pretty interesting here is we're probably, in theory, on this picture, up in top of, what's the name of the hill? Federal Hill. I'm glad you guys are awake. I also like the fact that you can see steamships are starting to replace the wind sailing ships. It's just a fascinating piece of artwork that you can access. Okay, so here's the place I grew up. And you can see here, this is the original log cabin. This is 2 stories at the moment. Addition added onto that. And I can literally, by looking at this picture, I can smell the baking hanging in the back room. I can go in the attic and smell the printer's ink. We had a hand press up there we made our Christmas cards with. I can smell the wine throughout the house because my father always made wine, always blew up. But this is my touchstone stone to the past. No. I should have said you have to read the book to answer that.
Oh, okay. We don't preserve much.
But my kids would never have that knowledge of hanging a ham or bacon in your back room or, well, I guess I've tried to make some wine in my life, but not much success. But again, it was a place that had been there for quite a while by the time that I lived there. And anybody cares, this is the pecan tree in the book. Very important tree. Okay, the house was to the right. We had 2 fairly large barns here. This is snow covered. This barn was about 50 by 50 by 50. We probably brought in a couple of thousand bales of hay each year. As a family project. Most of the time it was my sister and I and my mother driving the truck and my father that we would get the hay in. And this second story of this building was almost like a museum to me. We never touched it because it's full of all this equipment that was pulled by horses not that long before. I mean, certainly, and the tractors started somewhere in the 19th century, but there was a lot of horse-drawn action too, early to mid 20th century. So we got to play with all this stuff. But okay, so this particular farm at this particular time, and this is all first-person knowledge, right? Because I lived it, so it's a primary source information. Certainly we had sheep, up to maybe 50 or 60 sheep. Guess who had to shear all those sheep? Hardest job I've ever done. My back still hurts from it. We always had cattle, pigs, horses, not for any good reason except we enjoyed horses. So that was a pleasure. My sister spent a lot of time on the horses. We sold a couple thousand turkeys a year initially. That was a cash crop for us. But depending on a lot of people, all neighbors coming back, driving back to pick it up. Ducks, chickens, dogs. I think my father would sell anything on the farm that somebody else wanted because you had to really scrape through a lot of times, right? So we had English setters and English pointers and hunting dogs. Back then pedigree dogs was something, right? So we used to have 4 or 5 dogs and then blessed every couple of months with maybe 8 or 10 pups. So we had over 20 dogs sometimes. And so he was happy to sell them to people. I think he gave a lot away, actually. Okay. Now, what can I say? My job was painting and repairing a lot of fencing. So what's the formula for whitewash? Anybody know?
Chalk and water or something. Something white and powder.
Yeah, chalk or alkaline. I mean, you look it up now, it says 1-to-3 ratio with water. You diluted your paint. But I think we had lime that we mixed in. Okay, but anyhow, you get all over your body if you get close to it. This is my cousin Raji behind there, trying to keep away from the spray that I was doing. But so life on the farm, was like a constant something to do, right? Which you could enjoy or you can complain about, but you usually get some value out of that experience. So sheep shearing, corn picking, and my father used to talk all his friends into coming over to pick the corn by offering them a pig roast at the end of the day. So really it was a lot of fun for most of us. Hay baling, horse shows. Anybody remember the Joppa Magnolia 4-H Pony Club?
Yeah, was in it.
Oh, good. Well, we had shows twice a year.
Uh-huh.
And it was a lot of fun. I thought it was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
In retrospect, right? Turkey process, tree planting, tree selling. Okay, we'll get to that. Okay, what do we got next here? I don't know if you all realize it, but when they put I-95 in, there's a 60-foot right-of-way on the east side of it that has this 9-foot culvert buried underground that they've used to, it's backup water supply for Baltimore City and the surrounding counties. And I think they've used it once or twice. But it's always been there, been there since 62. And now I guess they're putting roads on top of it as they're widening to that direction. But this was what woke me up one morning when the big earth movers came through town, and not through town, through my backyard, through the woodlot. Very emotional time, because before that, you could sit in the middle of our property and not see anybody. It's like, it was all woods around us. And so that happened at that point, and it pretty much decimated the economic value of the house because you didn't have enough room now to grow the grain to feed the pigs. So it was, we had to look for something else, and Dad, I don't know if that's the only reason, but Dad decided to plant trees as a sound barrier to the highway because, really destroyed the ambiance of the farm, right? So we planted 35,000 trees and sold off, a few hundred every year as we thinned it, as it got older. So this is a tree they're loading. So it turned out to be an okay cash crop for us for the last 30 years that he lived there. Okay, what else here? Okay, so that was all the setting of that farm and its experience in modern history, right? That's the last 50, 60, 70 years. What I got in these boxes was what was left when the property was sold. We couldn't get anybody to farm it, so it was sold and it was developed. Let me tell you, that's a very emotional problem to do, a process to go through. I don't know how many of you had something like that, whether it was your parents' place or your grandparents or Aunt Susie. I mean, to lose something like that is unsettling and it's tough for a family because, not everybody's in agreement, right, to what's happening. But somebody has to make those decisions. So when the family was sold, we lost all those touchstones to the past. We unearthed a lot of family stories, which was the good side of all that. And I really came away from I wanted to know how my ancestors, who they were and how they might have dealt with the problems of their time. And so I thought more and more about this, and I said, well, it's not just my family that's important here. You know, I'm going back 3 or 4 generations. Doesn't matter if it's my great uncle or your great uncle. If it tells me something about that era that helps us understand better what the history was like and the challenges they faced. So I wanted to engage others in this process, and I wanted to tell this bigger story of what the American dream had been for many people. So this book was written by my great-great aunt, wrote it down when speaking with her great aunt, and you can get this on Amazon today. But it's a book that was published in 1859 about the family leaving the British Isles and coming here. And so that's one of the items we got. And we have a bunch of these. Anybody have something that looks like this? Is your name on there multiple times? Like Ned the First, Ned the Second, Ned the... No. I mean, it's a fascinating thing to look at. And like, we mainly look at it when somebody's getting married. And we think, oh, having a baby, right? So we're trying to tell them, oh, there's a lot of Josiahs or somebody, you know, a lot of these interesting names. But there's a lot of ancestors. You know, I have 2 parents, right? And I have 4 grandparents, and I have 8 great-great-grandparents. I had 16, 32, 64. I mean, go back 10 generations, you have over 1,000 direct ancestors, plus everybody in between. So that's a lot of information, but most of that information is the day somebody was born, the day somebody died. You know, it's the day they moved into America. Very frustrating in that way if you want to know much about those people. I just have to look, you know, towards my older cousins to try to guess what my great-grandfathers might have been looking like. Okay, so there's a lot of these, which is great to have. And then you look at the detail, and again, it's the 6th or 11th child of some judge, you know, so you don't know a lot. But this is a start, right? But we're lucky to have at least that kind of lineage of names and tree. Okay, so here are the references and artifacts, some of the artifacts that I did have that were, again, primary source things. Not there's lots of information about it, but look here. Certainly family trees, diaries, letters, photographs. Here's something written in 1938, but goes back, 700 years. Hope sustains the farmer. Okay, so the Tillman lineage had a lot of farmers, evidently, in it. Can't believe that would be what am I trying to think of? You have this problem forgetting something? Coat of arms, that's what it was. Okay, so, and then the book I just mentioned a second ago, Sunrise, Sunset. Then there's a book called Town Hall Tonight. I know all you guys are experts of the Booth family. It's so close to here, you probably read about it a lot. And so what was the Booth family heritage? It was one of acting, right? And so many of us don't realize that there was something before TV and radio. My kids have no appreciation for that. It was just 100 years ago, right? And so I point that out because Town Hall Tonight does mention some of my relatives who were also actors and actresses. And we have this book on the right written by my grandmother because when she was born, her mother died. So her father gave her to her aunt, and her aunt was part of a thespian group that traveled the country. And so we have some of that acting heritage. We'll talk about that later. Okay, so in here we mentioned, and then a little girl goes barnstorming. She wrote in 1939 about her travels from 1882 to 1900. We also have fine cotton veils with Vote for Women on it from probably the 1920s. We have ration cards and coins and stamps from some of the wars. We have guns and swords and uniforms. No stories that came down with those, but we have the artifacts. Wooden oxen yokes, leather horse yokes and tack. I mean, it's not a lot of that kind of stuff. Again, giving us a little bit more depth about who some of these ancestors were. Okay, then we have the mystique of family stories. Have you passed all your family stories on to the next generation? Do you know if any of them are true? There's a mystique about it, and there's something there, I'm sure. I just was amazed. Looking at that one family tree I showed you a minute ago, I learned that my ancestors were nonconformists, Quakers, Unitarians, Swedenborgians, Separatists, Orange Men, High Masons, Anglicans, Episcopalians, and Catholics. So, yeah, and I know in England that we lived in the same little town for 800 years. And my DNA is pretty specific, and then you see all this variety all of a sudden as, we burst out of Europe. All those land reforms over in England and Ireland, a lot of people were kicked off the land. They had to go someplace. So we got a lot of them got active, and some of them lived. Okay, what else do we have here? Mystique of family stories. Yeah, so my great-grandfather was a surgeon in the Civil War. I don't think that sounds very romantic. You think what that, and I hope you all get to read the chapter about Nathan. Sea captains. Well, who's a sea captain? Is he a pirate or is he a good guy? Does he have a letter of marque saying he's acting for Madison or something? My mother loved the sea captain story and the buried treasure aspect of it. Now, do I trust my mother? She told me lots of things. Abolitionists, suffragettes, actors, lots of material to draw from. But the whole question is, all of them, each of them is a rabbit hole, isn't it? And we can go down a long ways. And how are we doing time-wise?
It's about 10 minutes of 3.
10 to 3. I have another 140 slides, Jackie. Okay, where are we going here? So this is the Andrews Dramatic Company. Here's my grandmother and Dick's grandmother. Wake up, Dick. Is that your grandmother? And they went up to Montana and Colorado and Wyoming and Salinas, Kansas. I mean, they went all over by buggy, by train, by the ways they used to bring people up in the mountains for mining. Up. And so she spent all these years being an actress, being a salesperson, being a liaison to town businesses, all these things it takes to subsidize a performance on Tuesday night. Come see the dramatic Andrews sisters. Well, she also became, with one of her aunts, the first owned woman's newspaper in America. And it lasted a few years. And here's a picture in a newspaper of she and her 3 buddies visiting an exhibition, a world exhibition, at $10 a day. And then she ended up being in public relations up in the New York City area for utility companies. And my grandfather, who worked for the utility down in Baltimore, what's now BG&E, called up his friend up in New York and said, I need the best PR man you've got. The guy chuckles and said, the best PR man we got is a woman. And so he trusted her, brought her down, and within a year they got married. So he had to get another PR person. But she wasn't idle. In fact, how they got married was every weekend he would say, let's take another trolley ride out to the end of the trip. The trolleys would bring people into the city and take them out, but like in Bayshore, and there's a number of Electric City, what's it called? Where at the end of the track there was some amusement park. And they would go to Bayshore and I think fish and swim and dine and, come on home. So she got a good look at the city so she could manage it better, right? The last trip they took was to Ellicott City. They got off the train, climbed up in the hills to watch the sunset. And her diary, which is the best diary we've had, ends with a sentence that's completely marked out. So I don't know what happened that evening. So that's why that trolley is up there. Okay, so what did I learn? Well, as what we all learn as we age, life is complex and gets more complex all the time. And it's very hard to judge a person or an era based on one thing they did. You can certainly identify and recognize it, but I don't know the challenges these people face. And I have to admire the ones that did make it through. Freedom from who, what? All these questions we address all the time. I think everybody's had this fear of the future. I know when I was growing up, I certainly had a fear for the nuclear standoff. And then there are lots of other things over the years. And the kids today don't have that perspective. A lot of the things we face today, if not all of the things we face today, we faced before. Standard human challenges. They might be different. But certainly offering our kids some perspective of the challenges we went through and the ones we knew from before, I think has a great deal of value. Vigilante justice, or some would say vigilante injustice. Depends on what side of the debate you're on. But if it's a debate, then it might be healthy. Judging others. And this whole concept of family, which today we have this vast diaspora, right? Diaspora, where we all take off with kids in California or England or whatever. We're losing something, and we're gaining something in that process. But the whole concept of empathy, I think, is something you don't hear about a lot. But I think if you read the book, you probably recognize that I talk about that, hoping more of that will happen. The challenges were similar. I mean, pandemics. Who remembers the Asian pandemic of 1957? I remember wearing masks. I wasn't allowed to go to school for a week or two. My sister contracted something, we couldn't go in the room. I mean, we've had these fears before. The fragility of democracy. To this day, I don't know if our democracy is weak and fragile or strong. We're here and we produce an economy, a system that has lots of goods and evils, right? But here we are, appreciating history together. Okay, so the stories we tell, I hope we tell stories that give perspective, give help to other people. And I always have to ask myself, what would I have done in those shoes? It's like a good question. And yeah. And this picture, that could have been me. Has anybody else had a time in their lives they had to sit down and contemplate what was going on and what was important? I think we all have that several times. Yeah. I have a better pair of jeans than he has, but same problems. Okay, so in the book I've written, I touch on all these things. I try to bring humanity into all of our ancestors. No matter whether they're good or bad, top of the order, bottom of the order, that's the thing we try to do, I think, is have empathy, let these people breathe like humans. And I figured I had to make these characters up once I went back 5 or 6 generations, right? A composite of the information I have and the information other people have published on. And so these composites, I drew them up, sketched them out, and then let them run with it. Of course, they running with my subconscious too, but they tell the story. Pirates, bounty hunters, English loyalists. What happened when all the men went to Yorktown and all the women were left behind to run the firm when the loyalists were probably the people that didn't go to Yorktown? They were running the shops and the ports. So there's probably quite a bit of conflict between those two groups. Try to deal with addiction as honestly as I could. Suffragettes, immigrants, and the end of an era that firm and many firms, thousands of firms like it, don't exist today. So I would say the things I learned, or I think follow the book, is the whole theme of the tenacity of the average immigrant. Strong women, strong men, it took them both. A real appreciation for the land, because they lived off their land. And they had to live it when the port of Joppa got frozen in. And we all have this potential for good and evil. And I think the dream of America for me is much greater than it was a couple of years ago. Because I realize it takes something more than just a good harvest one day, or you're cutting the tree down, or you got a good deal on something. It's this concept of there's hope, right? There's hope in the future that our kids will have it better than we have it today. I mean, there's hope that Attila the Hun is not going to come over the hill, right? I mean, there's a lot of these challenges, and some of us may have real challenging times. But with each other, with a sense of empathy, I think America will do better in the future. And I really appreciate the effort that you all do by understanding history, sharing it with each other, and hopefully pass down the best of what we all have. So the book came out this spring. I make no money off this book. All my proceeds, if I get any, go into nonprofits in this area, either historical ones or environmental ones. But my challenge is not just to talk to you tonight, but to ask you to be an ambassador for some of these concepts, some of these themes. I mean, I need more opportunities to get the book out there. I would love for you to read it, give me a call, we can talk about it. But my challenge is making sure it's value to this generation. So it's based on a lot of many real events. Characters represent composite people, and explores how people have dealt with the moral issues of their time, which are not much different than ours. So how do I share that? Just talking to you. Thank you very much. That's it. So I need a bunch of volunteers in case I get any tough questions. I'd be happy to address any questions you might have. Like, is any of this real? Yes, go ahead.
So if you go back and look at the genealogy, were there generations that had 8 children, 9 children, and then the next generation had 3, 1 child? I mean, what did you see in the sizes of families if you look back at the genealogy?
From a high level, what I think I saw was the impact of the economic model we were following at that time, where there was a real need for bodies, to work the labor jobs. On a detailed basis, what did I see? It seemed like for a long period of time we needed labor, and you can hire labor, you can enslave people to be labor, you can have a lot of kids. So many of these groups, not just the big companies or big families or small families, a lot of them needed to work together to support a labor effort that could meet the needs of the whole family. I'm sorry, she was asking about the sizes of families down through the ages. And so that's my best guess. Thank you. Yes?
Did your parents or any of your neighbors have any sense of the impact I-95 would have on your life? And how did they, was it just there like the elephant before they understood the impact?
My father and I had talked about this a number of times because I was 12 years old when it went through, and John F. Kennedy was here a week before he died, opening that Northeast Extension. Northeast Passage is Kenneth Roberts. 60 years later.
Northeast Expressway.
So when Dad bought the land, there was no evidence of that because he checked at the records that, he talked to people about it. Which is plausible because it was, 10 years later where it really happened. He had spent 2 years, though, the last 2 years of that, trying to stop it as soon as he heard about it. So he hired a lawyer. I think it was John Archer. Is it John Archer? What are you going to do, right? I went out and took the law in my hands and started breaking stuff on the highway. I wanted to stop this thing. As a 12-year-old, that was my emotional response. And in fact, the cops picked me up a couple of times for knocking, orange cones down the hill and things like that. But it was a shock. It was emotional. My mother said, okay, time to move to the suburbs, which she always said. But you think about it, I use I-95 all the time. There's 50,000 miles of expressway now built in America. All started with Eisenhower saying we need a military system, transportation system to get our military around. But also it's great economic support to build a big infrastructure. I just think of all those towns that have a highway running through it. I mean, we had 60 acres left on one side, but the other 50 acres, that was a 10-mile drive to get to it. So, you know, we didn't get that. But all these little towns that the highways pass, and many of them went bankrupt, right? So it had a huge ecological impact, you know, geographic, communities were all torn apart at that point. The churches especially, I'm sure, had the same problem. So I'm sorry, the question was, did I know much about how bad it's going to be for the farm when we got the farm?
Yeah.
Sorry.
On the map, was your house on the east side of 95 at the end of Bowles Lane?
Yes,
And then the rest of the land was northwest of that?
that's correct. Still just pretty much the east of the Little Gunpowder Falls. Yeah. The question was, where was my house? Come see me, and we're pointing out on the map.
How old was the original house on the property?
I used the date 1695 because that was the date on the plat. I don't know exactly what year it was built.
Could you tell from the genealogy?
I'm sorry, that was, how old was my property, right?
The house.
Yeah, the house, yeah, I'm sorry.
Could you tell from your genealogy, or letters or diaries, what was the sense of community that your family had back through the generations? Did they get around a lot? Did they use the train? Did they go on vacations? Where did they find their spouses? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Where were their boundaries that they established?
Okay, I think early on, a lot of those frontier folks were on their own. But the ones that were more successful was able to get their stuff to market and have more commerce going on. And so the closer you were to Joppa town, that was a critical thing. But most of the transport at that point in time was either oxen or horses and wagons. And you think about it, that didn't change much, did it, for a long time? I know different carriages and wagons up to 1900, right, when the automobile thing kind of took off. The other thing I'd like to comment is I was surprised when my father had a plane at one point before he got married, and so people were flying in the 20s and 30s. That was just starting, and my grandmother and her husband, my grandparents, took a plane to LA at some point. They had family there, and it had to stop 5 times to get there. You know, it was a multiple-day experience. We were so much slower than we have now. So, I mean, not to have that exactly right, but the transportation was critical. And I wish I had a date for that flight to California. But let's see, trains were, you know, big from about the 1830s is when Ellicott City had the first terminal. And then that eventually went to Cumberland, and then you could take a series of trains to the west. And that was, I can't tell you what the average speed of a train was, but that would be interesting to know. So, yes, any other questions, comments?
Yeah, right here.
Okay.
When you were growing up, before 95 was put through, you mentioned how hard your father worked, and you worked with your father. But farms need more labor than that. Did you have hired hands, or did you have brothers? I mean,
It depends on the farm. My father, throughout this whole time, worked full-time as a copper smelter in Baltimore because many small farms couldn't generate a consistent flow of cash.
Yeah.
And so when he took it over, I consider it was kind of a spent dirt farm, you know, because it had been plowed for 300 years, right? And so he put all these FDR conservation plans in place. And so Soil Conservation District became his coach, if you will. And they put in all these great things like multiflora rose natural fences, which we've cursed every day since. But he always had strips around the field. He put his first vacation on the farm, he spent home with his tractor building a big berm on a hillside so the water wouldn't flush off, carrying all the topsoil with it. So he would do things like that. But as far as workforce, before we were there were 4 or 5 tenant houses on that farm.
before any
Yes. Since we mainly had hay or grain, he was able to do that somehow on weekends. I had to feed the animals twice a day. but that was all good fun.
At least there was one son.
Well, my sister was probably better at it than I was. She was much
You had
more.
a sister.
I had a sister who was very responsible. In fact, we had to take over when we were like 10 or 11, morning and evening feeding. Is that about the right age? And she had to do it 5 years in a row before she went to college. I only had to do it the last 2 years, so she liked it.
Sounds like our place. My father was in the Navy most of his life, or the Merchant Marine, but he came from Illinois where they had a square mile. And so when the war was over, and we moved a lot because he was in the Navy. When the war was over, he was a wreck. I mean, he'd seen hundreds of his men burned to death, things like that. My mother thought it would be good for him to be out in the country, and as he wasn't a child. So they managed to find I called a little place, 76 acres, and the address was in western Baltimore County. It was just run down, and there was a lot of erosion, and we inherited some animals. I had to milk cows overnight. I mean, no one taught me, you know. But there were just 4 of us girls, and to support them and put them through college, or my father wanted to go back to the sea all the time because that was his life. But I mean, I wouldn't say we were farmers.
Do me a favor.
My father put in contour farming, multiplier rows, because Baltimore County and the state of Maryland was very active with their war here, you know.
Do me a favor, and I like to say this to everybody here. There's a box of information that you know better than anybody else.
Yeah.
And I really encourage you to collect the facts as best as you know them. If you want a bigger picture, or you can always write a fictional book, but you get the facts down and then talk to a society like this, you probably remember, and make sure they get it or somebody else gets it that could use in the future. Thank you. Question back here, I'm sorry.
Yeah, geological question, get back to the maps. You talked about the coastal plain versus the key line, the fall line. Another definition for that would be where tidewater ends and you have flowing rivers and streams and whatnot, where they end and tidewater begins, basically.
That's right.
Yeah.
And interesting, we call it Gunpowder River, but a lot of it's tidewater, right?
Estuary, basically. Right?
And in fact, the whole bay, wasn't there when the Native Americans came here. Around 12,000 years ago, we still had ice up on top of the Canada, and the bay was a couple 100 feet lower than it is today. And so when the Native Americans came, they were probably next to the deep channel of the bay today, which is at 150 feet or so deep. That was the Susquehanna River in Maryland. And so most of that history of their history is underwater now.
Oh, and as far as the port silting in, that was a common problem back in the colonial times. It was up in Charlestown and Cecil County, that port up there did that same thing after that. Shut it down.
And I bet some people knew and recognized that was happening. I don't think that's the first time it's happened in human history, right?
Right, put 2 and 2 together and say what's causing this.
And you and I would have to agree on the solution. You know what I mean? I mean, just think of all of us if we had no rules or regulations or laws. I mean, we have to debate it or be a vigilante and take it. Or, it's.
I mean, it adds a huge cost because then you have to ship your tobacco or whatever that much further because the ships can't get into the port.
I mean, Britain was pretty important for us to get started. Yes.
What amazed me was even after Agnes, the silt that came down and what it did even in our area. I went over to we'd had fresh air camp years ago.
Oh yeah.
And now they go to, I can't remember the name of the place, but they don't do fresh air camp anymore. But that place I used to fish there when I was a kid. Harford Glen.
Oh yeah, yeah.
But it's silted up.
And it silted up so much, I couldn't believe the difference.
Get a
after
bucket parade to come take the silt out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm like, it wasn't the same place.
Yeah, yeah. Any other thoughts, comments?
Since it's Veterans Day, if anybody, I would just like to show this. This is my Uncle Norman Anderson. It's the most unique gravestone I've ever seen. It's at Trinity Lutheran on Route 7, just after Mountain Road. And
Yeah.
he was a prisoner of war in Japan, and they killed him a day before the war ended. They knew the war was going to end, and they killed all the prisoners of war. And my other uncle was still in Italy, and he had a picture and had an Italian sculptor make this 3/4 size, life size. If you see him, you can tell it's an Anderson. But I just wanted to mention that since it's Veterans Day. If you drive by there, it's real close as you pull in the little thing to Trinity Lutheran. It's right there, and it's quite different.
Neat. Thank you. Okay, thank you. I'm happy to hang out. Please buy a book if you have any interest in this. I'll sign it. That's pretty valuable.
Yeah.
I want to thank Ned for this very informative and interesting talk.